So I've come from the future, and it is good. I looked at all the future considerations that Eric put up there, and I realized that I've just about done everything already in the future. So I will tell you the future is good. This is my group. I'm the president of NorCal CarciNET. I'm glad to be here tonight. I feel like I've been talking neuroendocrine tumors and cancer therapies for about the last 6 hours. So some of this is a little repeat from earlier. I'll go over this quick, but for those of you who can't remember all of this, it's not so rare. We have the zebra as our symbol. As we mentioned earlier, the incidence has gone up, the prevalence has gone up. We have an increase in overall survival, which is also good for us. What this means is our prevalence is going up, is what does it mean for our orphan drug designation down the future? Not going to discuss this here because it will take too long. But one of the things that is often brought up is if we look at NETs as in the GI cancer world, which is where I just came from an entire meeting earlier this morning, this is the second largest GI cancer, which people don't really think about. As we talked about, this is just the locations, which we can talk about earlier. This is from the last year data that was put out about last year, I think. And what we can see, besides the fact of where the locations are, is that it's increasing, right? This is becoming more prevalent. We talked a little bit about the increase in survival that's gone on well, which is great, and we'll talk about how PRT does that, and the evolution of the NET treatments. You know, when I was diagnosed, we were about here, and that's all that was available, and some of them weren't really used all that much. Interferon hasn't been used around here in a while for NETs. And then we started having, I didn't update the slides altogether, but we started having a lot more approvals for this indication. And obviously, we had in 2018, we finally had Lutathera. What's interesting, since we had this conversation about imaging, is if you do the same slide for imaging, it's kind of short. So we really only had one new thing in the time, in the last 20 years for imaging, and this is from a paper I think I was on with you, Yusuf, on Gallium-68 Dotatate, about how we can't use it for people who just have symptomatic controls, but this was actually the meta-analysis of all the Dotatate papers. So as a patient, since I'm the end user here, and I've gone through many rounds of PRT with different agents at times, sorry this didn't come out exactly how it was, when you've progressed and you look at, we've talked about the guidelines, but it starts getting confusing really quickly. And this is part of our patient dilemma, of course, is if I take a look at, these are the recent guidelines that just came out from the NCCN, and you'll notice once you get, if your disease progresses, consider octreotide or lanreotide, some somatostatin analog, and then the ORs get really big, right? And when you're a patient and you look at, one of the challenges of being a patient, if I look at my patient community, is that we like concrete answers. We don't like uncertainty. And having all of these ORs is really challenging for us because we don't know what to do next. And when we listen to different physicians that are oncologists or nuclear medicine, depending where we end up and what tumor board looks at us, our ORs change. And that's uncomfortable because some of us go, many of us go and see many people, and we don't know quite how to evaluate that. We talked a little bit about Gallium-68 Dota, I call it Dota XXX because these are all of the things. So I can't remember how many of you are oncologists and may not be in nuclear medicine, but when Yusuf was talking about the generator that lasts for 271 days, that's it. That's in my hand. That is what is producing Gallium-68 from the germanium. You don't need much. You just, I think it's, what, hydrochloric you add to it to melt the cloud. the cow and you get it right off. So that's all we're talking about. When I first started giving these talks early last year, I was polling patients to see what they wanted or what they thought about having gallium-68 availability. And you know, we like that it's much more sensitive. We like that it's much less energy or radiation to the patient. We certainly like that the time to complete the scan is much less. This is good. Depending on what papers you read, a third of us will have some type of change in management. The overall patient experience is much, much better. The challenge that we're having, and we still have it, right? This got approved June 1st, 2016, and we are still fighting now. The SNMMI and many advocacy groups still have letters going on to Aetna to get coverage on the scan because they still call it experimental. I know there's work going on in the background to get that taken care of, but we're still seeing denials even with both the NCCN guidelines having it as part of it and with the appropriate use criteria being out now for over 6 months. So, and thank Ayala for taking this photo. I just have to give the photo credit in the right place. So Lutathera, of course, is new. This is really, we're talking January 25th. I think the first patients really started doing this late April or May. And so in the last 48 hours, I've gone out and tried to poll the patient community to say, well, what does this mean to you? What are your questions? Well, clearly we're thrilled to have it. I will tell you, I have 16 trips to Germany at this point for my treatment and for my follow-up. I will tell you it will be much easier to go and have it locally, or for most patients to go and have it locally. So it's much easier to have the treatment in the US. Patients are still really concerned about the short and long-term effects of the treatment. The amino acid thing that was discussed is being discussed a lot in the patient community of trying to figure out which sites are able to compound their own, like in Iowa, or can use a third-party compounding lab to actually get it. They're actually going to ask you these questions. They want to know about the things that they don't know about, the long-term toxicity of this treatment, how that compares to other things, and I think that's really important. You know, patients are afraid of radiation or nuclear medicine, and so the idea, if you can give them comparisons to what their other treatments are, is really important. We're really confused about certain aspects of the treatment. When to have it, you can see our confusion. Insurance coverage costs, we've had 20 years of PRT now in the world. This, depending on where you went, cost anywhere from $3,000 to $10,000 per treatment. Now hearing, even though insurance will cover it, or there might be other ways to have copay coverage, that a dose in the US is, you know, in the $40,000 to $50,000 range before you start adding on what a facility would do, has patients concerned about, well, will their insurance actually cover it? We didn't talk about this in earlier things, but many people, especially in your communities, are pre-treated. They've had a lot of treatment. They may have a lot of other comorbidities that patients now in Europe will not have because they're seeing this earlier in their treatment cycle. So we're going to deal with things that we haven't seen happen in Europe in a while, and perhaps when they first started using it more regularly, but you have a lot of people who are treated with serospheres or other radioembolization, or who may have had already 2 or 3 or 4 liver-directed therapies. And this will be interesting as this gets rolled out on how we work with those patients. As Eric mentioned, the release instructions vastly differ. Back in the days before the internet, we all didn't talk to each other. Now patients talk about, you know, I see some patients who isolate themselves from their family for 2 weeks post-treatment. Will actually either rent another apartment to go stay there so they don't expose their spouse or children, or move into different rooms. So how we talk about release instructions and what this means for the family is really important, because people are doing really crazy things because they're worried about the word nuclear. So we really need to understand this. Much to Eric's other slide is how can you have more treatments than 4? And patients are really willing to be, and I was in an early conversation somewhere in an NCI meeting about follow-on trials that may include PRRT or how that would work, and patients are really willing to be part of that, so that's really good. So a little bit more about NETs for those of you, some of you have seen these slides. This is actually a global NET survey that was done. We are, one of the reasons we're well educated and well networked is because for the most part, patients have gone a long time before they've actually gotten diagnosed. So they've had to work really hard to talk to each other to figure out what was going on with them, because you've got right here, 34% of these people needed 7 or more visits with their physicians to actually get diagnosed. 48%, nearly half respondents reporting 5 or more. People are told they're crazy, they have menopause. It takes a long time to get diagnosed with this disease. We are a wandering herd. I will say that hopefully this goes down, but this was before PRT was available in this country, and you had 50% that traveled outside of their state to get opinions or treatment. And I will say traveling, especially having either a nuclear medicine treatment or diagnostics, can be really interesting. And I will say only because I've gone through it so many times, and even at Stanford and even in Germany, that when someone doesn't understand you, yelling at them louder doesn't help. This is mostly for the technologists in the group. My first Gallium-68 PET was done in Germany, and I had a technologist yell at me and kept coming up with a biohazard bag, and I kept looking like, I didn't know what was going on. He was really at my face, and he did exactly what we do when someone doesn't understand us who speaks a foreign language. He kept, as he got closer, the volume kept increasing. Finally, someone who spoke English came up to me and said, "You're having problems, what's the problem?" And I said, "I don't know what he wants." He said, back and forth in German, he wants to know if you have any dentures, because it's not good. Could you put the dentures in the bag? So it doesn't always work. Language is interesting. I always talk about times I've described diarrhea, and that it took many times to finally figure out that even though I only went twice a day, it's still diarrhea, even though it doesn't match a conventional definition of diarrhea. This will hopefully not impact as many people as it used to, but we used to, when we came back from treatment from Europe, this is how long it could take to actually clear customs when you tried, because of the detector that Homeland Security uses to detect these things. I only mention that because while Homeland is mostly at international airports, they also hang out at bridges and tunnels. So talk to your patients about that. All the bridges and tunnels into and out of New York have people who actually monitor them as well. After my third treatment, 3 weeks later, I was having a lunch with my wife in Oakland and sitting at a sushi bar, and walked in, and all of a sudden there was, because we're about 4 miles from the Port of Oakland, and some custom guys were sitting down having lunch at the sushi bar, and all of a sudden every siren in the sushi bar went off, because the 3 guys who were there, their radiation detector all went off, and that was 3 weeks after I had actually had treatment. I had to explain to them that I was doing okay, and they decided to turn their belts off for lunch. So that was good. Let's go next. Let's see. For those of you who are physicians in here, you already know this, but we unfortunately use the University of Google to educate ourselves, and this is not always good. About half of us use this before we speak to you. a lot of the words that are coming, people who are coming to talk to you, if you do PRRT, if you do Lutathera, if you do, are actually bought by it. So the first 6 links that people are going to come and discuss with you are something that may have nothing to do with them just because those links are now being bought. I'm glad to know when you say PRRT, one of the sites that I wrote is second ahead of the SNMMI. Well, I'll have to work on that with the SNMMI, but that's all right. All right, I wanted to give you a little bit of fake news that we get, that we're decades behind treatments in Europe, just because it took a little longer to get it here. But really, all the treatments that are available there are available here. Sorry about the language there. The FDA held up PRRT approval because it was approved everywhere else first. Clearly, the FDA didn't do anything until they got their final data. That the NetSpot is the gold standard, and while I think it is a great scan, it's not the only scan. And we have to remind our patients that there are other things that might be appropriate. I get this every once in a while that now there's 350 different places that can do a NetSpot, but only a few places know how to read them. Actually, if you're looking at this and don't know how to read it, even a patient, you can sign up at the SNMMI for reader training, and pretty much you can get that. The other one I get, and only because Dr. Kuntz's CAPTEM study came out yesterday, is chemotherapy is not as effective for NETs, for poorly, well-differentiated NETs, and this is a plug for her abstract on Monday. So one other thing is, I will say we're scared of what we don't understand. When we did some surveying, we found that people who just are asked about, are they afraid or fearful of scans, that we get a pretty wide distribution of that people are really frightful of the damage that can be done by imaging. We get a third of the people who will actually try to measure, keep track of how much milligrams they are getting from their scans and try to figure out what their lifetime exposure is. After we've done some education, we find that virtually no one is concerned. And the last thing I want to do before I turn it back over to the panel and maybe some drinks, we talked about engaged partnerships. One where the patient community can help with, obviously, working to recruit for clinical trials, but we also can help in other ways that may not be so obvious. One of the things that happened, I believe it was I know it's 2014 because I wrote it down there, but in 2014, the federal government was going to get out of the germanium-68 supply, which would have cut it down by about a third. That would have been probably disastrous. They didn't have any idea that really NetSpot was going to come online. We'd have PSMA, Gallium-68 right afterwards. And we did, as a patient community, have a letter writing campaign to the DOE when they asked for comments that really did sway their decision to stay in the germanium-68. We've done other things with the SNMI and patient advocacy and trying to work with the FDA to make sure that when INDs need to be extended that we can. So we're actually a pretty good partner here. And with that, and having 5 minutes left for the panel, that's my crew, and I thank you all for listening.